when humanity walked out on the Galactic Council in a historic act of defiance. They didn't just abandon the table, they forced the entire galaxy to rebuild it. The Grand Assembly Hall buzzed with tension as Ambassador Sarah Chen stood at the human delegation's podium. For the past 3 hours, she had listened to the same recycled arguments, the same thinly veiled condescension, the same bureaucratic roadblocks that had defined humanity's relationship with the Galactic Council for the past 47 years. The motion to restrict Terran expansion into the Outer Rim systems passes by a vote of 731 to 116, announced Speaker Vorth, his serpentine form coiled around the central platform. His 6 arms moved in ritualistic patterns as he spoke, a gesture that Sarah had long since recognized as the Caltharian equivalent of smugness. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Sarah watched the voting display with growing frustration. The same coalition that had voted against human interests for decades, the Zephyrin Collective, the Hive Confederacy, the Crystalline Domains, had once again banded together, not because of any legitimate concern about human expansion, but because humanity's rapid technological advancement and resource acquisition threatened their comfortable position at the top of the galactic hierarchy. Representative Klix, the insectoid delegate from the Hive Confederacy, chittered his satisfaction. Perhaps now the humans will learn to respect the established order. Your species has been part of this council for less than half a century, yet you act as though you own the galaxy. Sarah's hands clenched at her sides. She thought of the mining crews who would now be forced to abandon their operations, the terraforming projects that would be shelved indefinitely, the colonies that would struggle without the resources they desperately needed. All because these ancient species couldn't bear to see humanity succeed. With respect, Representative Klix, Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. Humanity has followed every council regulation, paid every fee, and submitted to every inspection. We've contributed more to galactic defense, scientific advancement, and humanitarian aid in the past 20 years than most species have in centuries. Yet every proposal we make is shot down, every expansion is blocked, every innovation is subjected to decades of safety reviews. The Zephyrin representative, Zephy's, flickered with agitated energy patterns. Your species grows too quickly, expands too aggressively. You consume resources at an alarming rate and reproduce without consideration for galactic carrying capacity. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. The Zephyrians, who had strip-mined entire star systems down to their component atoms to fuel their energy-based civilization, were lecturing humanity about resource consumption. The Hive Confederacy, whose exponential reproduction had required the forced relocation of 17 species, was concerned about human birth rates. Sarah looked around the assembly hall one final time. She saw the smug satisfaction on Klix's compound eyes, the dismissive wave of Counselor Threx's tentacles, the barely concealed contempt radiating from the crystalline formations that represented the Silicon Collective. These beings had made their position clear. Humanity would be tolerated, but never truly accepted. They would be allowed to exist on the galaxy's terms, not their own. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a simple data pad. The motion she was about to read had been drafted months ago, approved by Earth's government and every human colony in the galaxy. They had hoped it would never be necessary. Speaker Vorth, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the celebratory murmurs. I invoke Article 15 of the Galactic Compact. The hall fell silent. Article 15 hadn't been invoked in over 300 years. It was the withdrawal clause, the diplomatic equivalent of flipping the table and walking away. Speaker Vorth's phosphorescent scales dimmed with surprise. Ambassador Chen, surely you don't mean to. I do. Sarah's voice carried clearly through the vast chamber. By the authority vested in me by the Terran Federation and its allied colonies, I hereby formally withdraw humanity from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. The reaction was instantaneous. Representatives erupted from their seats. Their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of alarm. Energy beings flickered frantically, insectoids chittered in agitation, and the crystalline delegates resonated with harmonic distress calls. Sarah continued reading from her data pad, her voice steady despite the chaos. Furthermore, all trade agreements, defense pacts, and technological sharing arrangements between humanity and Council member species are hereby terminated. All Council representatives are requested to vacate Terran space within 72 standard hours. Councillor Threx, the ancient cephalopod who had led the Council for over 2 centuries, slammed his manipulator arms against his podium. You cannot do this. The economic disruption alone will what? Sarah interrupted, her composure finally cracking. Hurt your bottom line. Force you to actually innovate instead of relying on human technology. Make you realize that maybe, just maybe, you need us more than we need you. She closed the data pad and tucked it back into her jacket. For 47 years, humanity has tried to play by your rules. We've been patient, diplomatic, and respectful. We've contributed far more than we've received, and in return, we've been treated like unwelcome guests at our own table. The human delegation began to file out of their section, moving with coordinated precision. They had rehearsed this moment, knowing it might come to this. You want to restrict our expansion? Fine. Expand into the systems we're abandoning. You want to limit our resource extraction? Excellent. Extract your own resources without our mining technology. You want to regulate our trade? Perfect. Trade with each other using your own obsolete shipping methods. Sarah paused at the exit, turning back to address the stunned assembly one final time. Humanity is done asking for permission to exist. From now on, we'll be writing our own rules. The emergency session convened within hours of humanity's withdrawal. The assembly hall, which had seemed so vast and impressive just that morning, now felt empty and hollow. The human delegation section stood vacant, a glaring reminder of what had just transpired. Speaker Vorth coiled nervously around his platform as representatives shouted over each other in dozens of languages. The careful decorum that had defined council sessions for millennia had evaporated in the face of an unprecedented crisis. Order. Order. Vorth's scales flashed in agitation. We must address this situation rationally. Councillor Threx's tentacles writhed with barely contained panic. Rationally? The humans control 23% of galactic shipping, 31% of heavy manufacturing, and 67% of our defense grid maintenance. Without their technology, half the Council's member species will face immediate supply shortages. Representative Zephy's flickered rapidly, her energy patterns betraying deep concern despite her earlier bravado. Surely they're bluffing. They can't simply cut ties with the entire galactic community. The economic suicide alone would hurt us far more than it hurts them, interrupted Delegate Coraxis from the Mineral Consortium. His rocky, geological form trembled with what might have been fear. I've been reviewing the trade data. We import 78% of our advanced electronics from human manufacturers. Our mining operations rely entirely on Terran-designed equipment. Without human maintenance protocols, our deep space extraction platforms will fail within 6 months. The hall erupted, again as the full implications began to sink in. For decades, the Council had taken human contributions for granted. Their technology had become so integrated into galactic infrastructure that most species had forgotten how they had managed without it. Clix's compound eyes darted nervously as he processed the data streams flooding in from Hive territory. The Confederacy's food production networks are already reporting system failures. Our bio-enhancement facilities require human-manufactured components that we never learned to produce ourselves. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The proud Hive Confederacy, which had boasted of its technological superiority for centuries, was dependent on human innovation for basic survival. Representative Nelthara from the Aquatic Federation's delegation bubbled anxiously. Our underwater city's life support systems use human atmospheric processors. If they stopped providing replacement parts ... double quotes, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that the loss of life support meant the death of billions. Counselor. Threx's ancient eyes closed in what might have been pain. How did we let this happen? How did one species become so integral to our civilization that their departure threatens our very existence? The question echoed through the chamber, but no one had an answer. Or, rather, everyone knew the answer, but was too proud to admit it. They had dismissed humanity as young and inexperienced, then gradually became dependent on human ingenuity while maintaining the pretense of superiority. Within 24 hours of the withdrawal announcement, the first human ships began departing from Council space. The sight was both impressive and terrifying. Massive cargo vessels, sleek diplomatic cruisers, and countless smaller craft streaming away from every major galactic hub. On the trade station orbiting Proxima Centauri b, Station Administrator Vex watched in growing horror as human personnel methodically shut down systems and prepared to leave. The humans had built and maintained most of the station's critical infrastructure, and their departure would leave it a floating hulk within days. Please, Administrator Williams, Vex pleaded, his crystalline form resonating with desperation. Surely we can reach some accommodation. Your people have worked alongside mine for 15 years. This station is as much yours as it is ours. Administrator Williams, a graying woman who had spent half her life in space, shook her head sadly. I'm sorry, Vex. I truly am, but the order comes from Earth itself. All human personnel are to withdraw from Council space immediately. She gestured to the massive holographic display showing the station's systems. Red warning indicators were already appearing as human-maintained subsystems began shutting down. We've uploaded detailed maintenance manuals and emergency procedures to the station's database. Your people are intelligent and capable. You'll figure it out eventually. Vex's form flickered with panic. Eventually, the atmospheric recycling system will fail in 6 days without human technicians. The gravity generators need recalibration. Every 72 hours, the quantum communication array requires. I know, William's voice was heavy with regret. And I wish there was another way. But your council has made it clear that humanity is welcome as equals. So, we're leaving. All of us, across the galaxy. Similar scenes played out on hundreds of worlds. Human colonies that had been established jointly with other species began the massive logistical undertaking of evacuating their populations. Mixed settlements face agonizing choices as human and non-human families were torn apart by political decisions made light years away. On New Kepler, the mining colony that had sparked the final confrontation, human and Caltharian workers had labored side by side for decades. Many had formed genuine friendships, even romantic relationships across species lines. Now, those bonds were being severed by forces beyond their control. Foreman Jake Morrison watched as the last human transport prepared to depart. His Caltharian counterpart, Slix, stood beside him, her normally vibrant scales dulled with sadness. This is madness. Slix hissed softly. We've worked together for 12 years. Our teams have saved each other's lives countless times. How can some distant bureaucrats undo all of that with a simple vote? Jake nodded grimly, because they stopped seeing us as partners a long time ago. To them, we were just useful tools, and when tools get to uppity, you put them back in their place. He shouldered his pack and headed toward the transport. Take care of yourself, Slix, and try to remember that not all humans wanted this. Some of us still believed in the dream of galactic cooperation. 3 weeks after humanity's withdrawal, the first major system failures began cascading across Council space. The Zephyrin Collective's energy distribution network, which had relied on human-designed quantum regulators, experienced catastrophic overloads. Entire sectors lost power, plunging billions into darkness. In the Hive Confederacy's core systems, automated food production facilities began shutting down as their human-manufactured bio-enhancement chambers failed one by one. The Hive's vaunted efficiency, built on millennia of genetic optimization, crumbled without the technological infrastructure that had supported it. Emergency council sessions became a daily occurrence. Crisis after crisis emerged. The proud species that had dismissed humanity's concerns just weeks earlier now faced the terrifying reality of their own technological dependence. Councillor Threx's tentacles trembled as he read the latest damage reports. The Aquatic Federation is reporting massive casualties. Their deepest cities are losing life support faster than they can evacuate populations. The crystalline domain's manufacturing sector has collapsed entirely. They can't produce basic components without human molecular assemblers. Speaker Vorth's scales have lost their phosphorescent gleam, dulled by stress and sleepless nights. What about our attempts to reverse engineer human technology? Surely our greatest minds can replicate their innovations. The silence that greeted his question was answer enough. Finally, Representative Coraxus spoke, his geological form seeming to shrink with embarrassment. Our engineers have been examining human designs for decades. The problem isn't understanding how they work, it's understanding how they were conceived. Human engineering philosophy is fundamentally different from ours. He activated a holographic display showing a human-designed fusion reactor beside a traditional Caltharian power generator. Look at this. Our reactor requires 847 components, each precisely manufactured and calibrated. The human design uses 23 components, but they're arranged in patterns that our computers classify as impossible or inefficient. Yet their reactor produces 3 times more power while using half the materials. Delegate Zephy's flickered weakly, her energy patterns dim with exhaustion. It's not just their technology, it's their entire approach to problem solving. Where we see obstacles, they see opportunities. Where we calculate risks, they imagine possibilities. We've spent so long perfecting what we know that we forgot how to discover what we don't. The admission was devastating. The Galactic Council, which had prided itself on representing the pinnacle of civilization, was being forced to confront the reality that they had become stagnant. Their technology had advanced incrementally over millennia, refined and perfected, but never truly innovative. Humanity, in their brief time on the galactic stage, had brought a fundamentally different perspective. They didn't just solve problems, they redefined them. They didn't just improve existing technology, they imagined entirely new approaches that more established species had never considered. Representative Clix's mandibles clicked nervously as he processed data from the Confederacy's territories. Our population centers are already showing signs of social unrest. When the food shortages become widespread, we'll face civil war. The hive depends on absolute efficiency. Any disruption threatens our entire social structure. The irony was bitter. These species had spent centuries building elaborate, efficient civilizations, but they had made those civilizations so specialized and interdependent that the removal of a single component, humanity, threatened to bring down the entire structure. As the 4th week of the crisis began, desperate measures became commonplace across Council space. Species that had barely acknowledged each other's existence were suddenly forced to cooperate in ways they had never imagined. The Zephyrian Collective, whose energy-based biology had made them natural enemies of the silicon-based crystalline domains, found themselves desperately negotiating for manufacturing assistance. The Aquatic Federation, traditionally isolationist, was pleading for aid from any species capable of producing underwater life support systems. In the council chambers, Speaker Vorth called for an unprecedented joint emergency session. Representatives from species that had never before attended the same meeting were forced to work together, their ancient prejudices and territorial disputes suddenly seeming petty in the face of existential threats. We must face the reality, Vorth announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Humanity's withdrawal has exposed fundamental weaknesses in our civilization. We have become despecialized, too dependent on a single source of innovation. Councillor Threx's tentacles writhed in agitation. Are you suggesting we abandon millennia of cultural development The separation of species has been the foundation of galactic peace for 3,000 years. Peace. Representative Nelthar's aquatic suit bubbled with emotion. What peace? My people are dying because we were too proud to learn human technology ourselves. We preferred to maintain our cultural purity while depending on others for our survival. The debate that followed was unlike anything in Council history. Species that had maintained careful diplomatic distance for centuries were suddenly forced to examine their own limitations. The Hive Confederacy admitted they had sacrificed individual creativity for collective efficiency. The crystalline domains acknowledged that their perfect mathematical models couldn't account for the kind of intuitive leaps that drove human innovation. Delegate Coraxus rumbled with what might have been shame. We mocked them for being young and inexperienced. We dismissed their ideas as unproven or reckless, but perhaps what we called recklessness was actually courage. The courage to try something that might fail, instead of perfecting something that would never truly succeed. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Council was being forced to question not just their policies, but their entire approach to civilization itself. Emergency committees were formed to address the immediate crises, but even these efforts revealed the depth of the problem. Committee members found themselves constantly asking, how would the humans approach this? Or, what would human engineers do? They had become so accustomed to human solutions that they had forgotten how to generate their own. Representative Zephy's, her energy patterns now dim with exhaustion, made a suggestion that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Perhaps we should consider sending a delegation to Earth, not to demand their return, but to ask for their help. The chamber erupted in debate. The idea of the proud Galactic Council begging for assistance from the species they had just rejected was almost unthinkable. Yet as the reports of system failures and social unrest continued to pour in, the unthinkable began to seem like the only viable option. By the 6th week, the crisis had evolved from technological failure to existential threat. Entire sectors of space were going dark as power grids failed and couldn't be repaired. Refugee fleets carried millions of displaced beings between star systems, searching for any place that could support their basic survival needs. The Galactic Council's carefully maintained order was crumbling. Species that had coexisted peacefully for millennia were now competing desperately for resources, aid, and the few remaining human-built systems still functioning in neutral space. In the Council chambers, a grim realization was taking hold. Councillor Threx, his ancient form seeming frailer with each passing day, addressed the assembled representatives with a voice heavy with defeat. We have always prided ourselves on being the guardians of galactic civilization, he began. We believed that our experience, our wisdom, our established traditions were the bedrock upon which peace and prosperity were built. We were wrong. The admission sent ripples of shock through the assembly. Threx had led the Council for over 2 centuries, had been the architect of many of the policies that had shaped galactic society. For him to acknowledge failure was unprecedented. Humanity challenged our assumptions from the moment they joined us, he continued. They questioned our methods, proposed alternatives to our traditions, and consistently demonstrated that there were better ways to solve problems we had considered solved. And we responded with condescension and obstruction. Representative Clix's compound eyes reflected the harsh truth. We maintained our positions of authority by ensuring that no one else could challenge them. We didn't reject human innovations because they were dangerous. We rejected them because they were better than ours. The painful process of self-examination revealed layer after layer of institutional failure. The Council had become so focused on maintaining the status quo that they had forgotten the very purpose of civilization, to improve the lives of their citizens. They had chosen stability over progress, tradition over innovation, and pride over pragmatism. Speaker Vorth's scales flickered weakly as he read the latest reports. The casualty figures are becoming significant. The Aquatic Federation has lost 3 major cities, The crystalline domains are facing complete manufacturing collapse. The Hive Confederacy is reporting food riots in 17 sectors. The numbers were staggering, but they represented more than mere statistics. They were the price of arrogance, the cost of rejecting partnership in favor of dominance. Each casualty was a life lost because the Council had been too proud to treat humanity as equals. Delegate Zephy's, her energy form now barely visible, made the suggestion that everyone had been avoiding. We need to send a formal delegation to Earth, not as representatives of a superior galactic authority, but as supplicants. We need to admit our mistakes and ask for their help. The word supplicants hung in the air like a death sentence. The Galactic Council, which had positioned itself as the supreme authority in known space, would have to humble itself before the species it had rejected. But as the reports of system failures and mounting casualties continued to arrive, pride became a luxury they could no longer afford. The selection of the delegation to Earth became an exercise in political suicide. No one wanted to be the face of the Council's humiliation. Yet someone had to make the journey. After days of debate and deliberation, 5 representatives were chosen, not for their diplomatic skills, but because they represented the species most critically affected by humanity's withdrawal. Councillor Threx, despite his advanced age, insisted on leading the delegation. I helped create this disaster, he stated firmly. I should be the one to face the consequences. Representative Clix from the Hive Confederacy was chosen to represent the manufacturing crisis. Delegate Zephy's would speak for the energy-dependent species. Coraxis would address the mining and resource extraction problems, and Nelthara from the Aquatic Federation would represent the life support emergencies that threaten billions of lives. The journey to Earth was conducted in one of the few remaining human-built diplomatic vessels still in Council space. Cruel irony that wasn't lost on any of the delegates. As they traveled through hyperspace, the magnitude of their task weighed heavily on them. What do we even say? Clix chittered nervously. How do you apologize for 47 years of systematic discrimination? How do you ask for help from people you've spent decades trying to control? Threx's tentacles coiled with anxiety. We tell them the truth, that we were wrong, that our pride blinded us to their value, that we need them more than they need us. The admission was painful, but necessary. The delegates spent the journey rehearsing their words, preparing for what might be the most difficult diplomatic mission in galactic history. Earth appeared in their viewports like a blue-white jewel, unchanged by the political upheaval that had shaken the galaxy. But as their ship approached the planet, they were surprised by what they encountered. Instead of the angry rejection they had expected, they were greeted by a small fleet of human vessels that escorted them safely to the space station orbiting Earth. The humans were professional, courteous, and efficient, but there was an unmistakable distance in their interactions. Ambassador Sarah Chen met them in the station's main conference room. She was flanked by a team of human officials, but the elaborate ceremony and protocol that had defined their previous interactions was notably absent. Councillor Threx, Sarah said simply. I'm surprised to see you here. Threx's ancient form seemed to shrink under her steady gaze. Ambassador Chen, we come to ask for your help. Our civilization is collapsing without humanity's contributions. We made a mistake. The words came out in a rush, carrying the weight of desperate honesty. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she had been expecting this moment. A mistake, she repeated quietly. Is that what you call 47 years of treating us like unwelcome guests? Is that what you call blocking every initiative we proposed, rejecting every innovation we offered, and consistently voting against our interests even when they aligned with galactic welfare? The delegates exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had prepared for this moment, but the reality of facing their victims was more difficult than they had imagined. The conference room was silent except for the soft hum of the space station's life support systems. Systems that, ironically, were built using human technology. The delegates from the Galactic Council sat across from the human negotiating team, the weight of their civilization's failures pressing down on them. Sarah Chen studied the data pads that the delegates had brought, each one containing detailed reports of the cascading failures across Council space. The numbers were staggering: millions dead, billions displaced, entire sectors of space going dark as infrastructure collapsed. The Aquatic Federation has lost 40% of its deep-sea cities, she read aloud. The Crystal Indo-Main's manufacturing capacity has dropped by 78%. The Hive Confederacy is facing complete social collapse as food production fails. She looked up from the reports. These are the consequences of your decision to restrict human expansion and technological sharing. Nelfara's aquatic suit bubbled with desperation. We understand that now. We see how dependent we had become on human innovation. But surely, you can't want to watch entire civilizations collapse. Innocent lives are being lost because of political decisions they had no part in making. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. You're right. Innocent people are suffering. But let me ask you something. Where was this concern for innocent lives when you blocked food shipments to human colonies in the Outer Rim? Where was this humanitarian spirit when you refused to share medical technology that could have saved thousands of human lives? The questions hit like physical blows. Each delegate could remember specific instances when they had voted against human welfare, when they had prioritized political considerations over humanitarian concerns. Clix's mandibles clicked nervously. We didn't see it that way at the time. We thought we were maintaining galactic stability, preserving the balance between species. Balance. Sarah's voice carried a sharp edge. You mean the balance that kept humanity perpetually subordinate? Despite our contributions, the balance that ensured older species maintained their privileged positions regardless of merit or capability. Counselor Threx's tentacles writhed with what might have been shame. Yes, that balance, and we see now how wrong we were. Humanity didn't threaten galactic stability, we did, by refusing to adapt, by clinging to outdated hierarchies, by prioritizing our own comfort over progress. The admission hung in the air like a turning point. For the first time in the meeting, Sarah's expression showed something other than professional coldness. So, what exactly are you asking of us? She said. Do you want us to come back to the council? To return to the same system that treated us as second-class citizens? To pretend that nothing has changed? Representative Zephy's flickered with what might have been hope. No, we're asking for something much more difficult. We're asking you to help us build something better. A new form of galactic cooperation based on genuine partnership rather than arbitrary hierarchy. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering. Around the table, her human colleagues exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. That's an interesting proposition, Sarah said finally. But words are easy. What concrete changes are you prepared to make? What guarantees can you offer that this isn't just desperation talking? Threx activated a holographic projector, displaying a document that had taken weeks to prepare. We propose the dissolution of the current Galactic Council structure and the establishment of a new body, the Galactic Confederation. No single species or group of species would hold permanent authority. All decisions would be made by consensus, with each member having genuine veto power over policies affecting their territory. Sarah studied the proposal, her eyebrows raising, as she read through the details. You're talking about dismantling 3,000 years of governmental structure. The political upheaval alone would be massive. Yes, Coraxus rumbled, but the alternative is the collapse of our civilization. The past weeks have taught us that our current system is unsustainable. We built a galaxy-spanning society on a foundation of inequality and stagnation. It was bound to fail eventually. The proposed reforms were radical beyond anything previously considered. The hereditary positions that had defined galactic politics for millennia would be abolished. The complex hierarchy of species classifications would be eliminated. Most importantly, Technological sharing would become mandatory rather than optional, ensuring that no single species could become indispensable. Clix leaned forward eagerly. We're also proposing the establishment of joint research initiatives, shared educational programs, and integrated colonial development. Instead of maintaining separate spheres of influence, we would work together to explore and develop new territories. Sarah continued reading, her expression thoughtful. This is essentially a complete restructuring of galactic civilization. The logistics alone would take decades to implement, which is why we need humanity's help. Nelth Ara said, "Your people have shown a talent for managing complex systems and coordinating large-scale projects. Without human expertise, this transition would be impossible." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The same species that had been dismissed as too young and inexperienced were now being asked to lead the most ambitious political reformation in galactic history. Sarah set down the proposal and looked directly at each delegate. "Let's assume for a moment that humanity agrees to help. What's to stop this from becoming just another system where humans do all the work while others reap the benefits? What guarantee do we have that we won't end up in the same subordinate position, just with different titles?" The question struck at the heart of their deepest fear. The delegates had prepared for accusations and anger, but they hadn't fully considered the possibility that humanity might simply refuse to help, regardless of the consequences. Threx's ancient voice carried a note of desperate sincerity. "Because this time, we're not offering you membership in our system. We're asking you to help us build a system together. Equal partners from the beginning, with equal say in how it develops. And if we refuse," Sarah asked quietly, the silence that followed was answer enough. Without humanity's help, the galactic civilization that had taken millennia to build would collapse within years. Billions would die, and the survivors would face a dark age that might last centuries. Sarah called for a recess, and the human delegation withdrew to a private conference room. Through the transparent aluminum walls, they could see Earth spinning slowly below them, beautiful and serene, untouched by the chaos that had engulfed the rest of the galaxy. "What do you think?" asked Dr. Marcus Webb, Earth's chief scientist and Sarah's closest advisor. "Can we trust them?" Sarah stared out at her home planet, considering the weight of the decision before her. "I don't think it's about trust. It's about whether we can build something that makes trust irrelevant." Admiral Lisa Santos, representing the military perspective, leaned forward. "The strategic implications are enormous. If we help them rebuild, we become the de facto leaders of galactic civilization. But if we refuse, we're essentially condemned to isolation. Other species will never forgive us for letting their civilizations collapse when we could have prevented it." Dr. Webb nodded grimly, "And the moral implications are even worse. We're talking about billions of lives, children who had nothing to do with the Council's decisions, entire species facing extinction because of political failures." Sarah turned back to her colleagues. "The question isn't whether we can help them. The question is whether we should, and whether we can do it without compromising our own principles." The debate that followed touched on everything from practical logistics to philosophical questions about humanity's role in the galaxy. They discussed the risks of becoming too entangled in galactic politics, the dangers of shouldering responsibility for civilizations that had rejected their help for decades. But ultimately, the decision came down to a simple choice. They could either help build something better, or watch something terrible unfold. "We've proven we can walk away," Sarah said finally. "We've shown that we don't need them, but maybe the real test isn't whether we can survive without them. Maybe it's whether we can rise above their failures and build something worthy of what we're capable of becoming." When they returned to the main conference room, the delegates were waiting anxiously. Sarah's expression gave nothing away as she took her seat. "Humanity will agree to participate in the restructuring of galactic governance," she announced, "but not as saviors coming to rescue a failed system. As partners building something new." The relief that washed over the delegates was almost palpable. Threx's tentacles trembled with what might have been gratitude. while Zeffie's flickered brightly, for the first time in weeks. However, Sarah continued, there will be conditions. Non-negotiable conditions. The hope in the room dimmed slightly as the delegates braced themselves for humanity's demands. First, the transition will be gradual and systematic. We won't rush to implement changes that could cause even more chaos. Second, every species in the new confederation will contribute equally to the rebuilding effort. Humanity won't carry the burden alone. Clicks nodded eagerly. Of course, we understand that. Sarah held up a hand. I'm not finished. Third, there will be complete transparency in all governmental processes. No more backroom deals. No more species-based voting blocks. No more hidden agendas. And fourth ... double quote she paused, meeting each delegate's eyes in turn. This is humanity's last attempt at galactic cooperation. If this fails, if we find ourselves marginalized or manipulated again, we won't just walk away. We'll make sure that no one else can benefit from our contributions either. The threat was clear, and it hung over the negotiations like a sword. Humanity had proven they could survive independently. They had also proven they were indispensable to galactic civilization. The combination made them perhaps the most powerful single force in known space. 6 months later, the first session of the Galactic Confederation convened in a new facility built specifically for the occasion. Unlike the intimidating grandeur of the old council chambers, the new meeting space was designed to emphasize equality and cooperation. No species had elevated positions. All delegates sat at the same level, arranged in concentric circles that encouraged face-to-face discussion rather than formal speeches. Sarah Chen, now bearing the title of co-coordinator alongside Threx, looked around the chamber with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The transition had been difficult, marked by setbacks, disagreements, and the occasional crisis. Several species had initially refused to participate, preferring to attempt independent recovery rather than submit to the new structure. But necessity had eventually brought even the most stubborn holdouts to the table. The hegemony of worlds, which had declared itself too proud to participate in human-led restructuring, had quietly requested membership after their industrial base collapsed completely. The Stellar Empire, which had attempted to maintain the old hierarchical system in their own territory, had been forced to abandon the effort when their younger member species began defecting to the Confederation. The first major test of the new system came when the Outer Rim mining dispute arose. Ironically, the same issue that had triggered humanity's original withdrawal. This time, however, the approach was completely different. Instead of predetermined voting blocks and political maneuvering, the dispute was addressed through the new collaborative resolution process. Representatives from all affected species worked together to understand the underlying issues, examine alternatives, and develop solutions that addressed everyone's concerns. The Caltharian delegate, Slicks, who had once worked alongside humans on New Kepler, presented data showing that unrestricted mining in certain systems would indeed damage delicate ecological balances. But instead of simply blocking the proposal, she worked with human engineers to identify alternative sites and develop new extraction methods that would minimize environmental impact. The Hive Confederacy, recognizing their own resource needs, offered to share bio-enhancement technology that could accelerate ecosystem recovery in previously mined areas. The crystalline domains contributed their expertise in molecular reconstruction to develop more efficient processing techniques that would reduce the total amount of raw materials needed. The final agreement was more comprehensive and effective than anything the old council had ever produced. It addressed environmental concerns while meeting resource needs, created new technological partnerships, and established monitoring systems that would prevent future conflicts. This is what we should have been doing all along, Threx admitted, during a private conversation with Sarah after the session. Instead of viewing every issue as a zero-sum competition between species, we should have been looking for solutions that benefit everyone. Sarah nodded, though her expression remained cautious. It's a good start, but we're still in the honeymoon phase. The real test will come when we face a crisis that forces difficult choices, when someone has to sacrifice for the greater good. That test came sooner than anyone expected. A massive stellar anomaly in the Vega system threatened to destroy the inhabited worlds of 3 different species. The gravitational distortions were increasing rapidly, and scientists estimated that complete evacuation would be necessary within 18 months. Under the old Council system, the response would have been predictable. Each species would have prioritized saving their own populations. Political considerations would have delayed decision-making, and resource allocation would have been determined by influence and voting power rather than need. The Confederation's response was different, but not without its challenges. The Joint Emergency Council convened within hours of the crisis announcement, bringing together representatives from every member species. The scale of the required evacuation was staggering. Over 2 billion beings would need to be relocated, along with critical infrastructure, cultural artifacts, and industrial equipment. Human logistics experts immediately began coordinating with their counterparts from other species, but it quickly became clear that the task was beyond any single group's capabilities. The Zephyrian energy manipulation technology would be crucial for safely moving delicate equipment. Hive Confederacy bioships could transport large populations efficiently. Crystalline domain quantum processors could manage the complex calculations needed to coordinate thousands of simultaneous operations. But the most difficult challenge wasn't technological, it was political. The refugee populations would need new homes, and that meant existing colonies would have to accept massive influxes of displaced beings. Economic systems would be disrupted, social structures strained, and resources stretched thin. Representative Vex from the crystal domains raised the concern that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. The mathematical projections are clear. Accepting this many refugees will reduce living standards across all member territories by approximately 23%. Some colonies will face resource shortages. Some species will experience significant cultural disruption. The old council would have spent months debating compensation formulas and burden-sharing agreements. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Click stood up, his compound eyes reflecting determination. The Hive Confederacy volunteers to accept 400 million refugees. We have recently completed expansion of 17 worlds, and our collective social structure can accommodate large population increases more easily than individualistic societies. Zephy's flickered brightly as she added, the Energy Collective offers to provide power infrastructure for all temporary settlements at no cost. Our technology can adapt to any species' needs. One by one, species that had spent millennia competing for advantage began volunteering resources, territory, and expertise. Not because they were forced to, not because of political calculations, but because it was the right thing to do. Sarah watched in amazement as the chamber filled with offers of assistance. I've never seen anything like this, she whispered to Threx. Neither have I, the ancient counselor replied. And I've been watching galactic politics for 3 centuries. This is what we were supposed to be, not competitors fighting over scraps, but partners working toward common goals. The Vega system evacuation became the largest cooperative effort in galactic history. Ships from dozens of species worked in coordinated fleets, their crews trained in joint operations that would have been impossible under the old system. Human organizational expertise coordinated with Caltharian environmental adaptation, while crystalline domain precision manufacturing worked alongside Hive Confederacy biological engineering. The operation wasn't without problems. Cultural conflicts arose when different species found themselves living in close quarters. Resource distribution challenges tested the new cooperative systems. Technical failures threatened to derail carefully coordinated schedules, but instead of becoming sources of permanent division, these problems became opportunities for innovation and collaboration. When Aquatic Federation refugees couldn't adapt to the standard atmosphere on temporary settlements, human atmospheric engineers worked with Zephyrian energy specialists to create hybrid environments that met everyone's needs. when food shortages threatened several refugee camps. The Hive Confederacy had their biocultivation techniques with agricultural specialists from multiple species, creating new hybrid food sources that were both nutritious and culturally acceptable to diverse populations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, leading the human medical relief effort, found herself working alongside beings she had only read about in textbooks. "It's fascinating," she told Sarah during one of their regular briefings. "Each species has developed medical techniques optimized for their own biology, but when we combine our knowledge, we're discovering treatments that work better for everyone." The success of the evacuation did more than save lives. It demonstrated that the new confederation could function under pressure. Species that had been enemies for centuries found themselves working as partners. Technologies that had been jealously guarded were shared freely for the common good. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For the first time in millennia, galactic civilization was defined not by competition and hierarchy, but by cooperation and mutual support. When the last transport ship departed the Vega system, and just hours before the stellar collapse, the entire galaxy watched in awe. The operation had succeeded not despite the diversity of the participating species, but because of it. Each group's unique capabilities had contributed to a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. 2 years after the formation of the Galactic Confederation, the changes were visible throughout known space. Former rivals had become research partners. Species that had maintained rigid territorial boundaries were now participating in joint colonial ventures. Most remarkably, the galaxy's overall technological advancement rate had accelerated dramatically. The old council's careful regulation of innovation had been replaced by active encouragement of experimentation and collaboration. The results were extraordinary. Hybrid technologies combining insights from multiple species were solving problems that had seemed intractable for centuries. Sarah stood in the observation deck of Unity Station, the Confederation's new mobile headquarters, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on humanity's latest contribution to galactic civilization, a series of deep space research platforms that would extend scientific exploration beyond the galaxy's rim. The construction crews themselves were a symbol of how much had changed. Humans, Caltharians, crystalline beings, and representatives from a dozen other species worked side by side, their different capabilities complementing rather than competing with each other. "The exploration fleet will launch next month," reported Dr. Webb, joining Sarah at the observation window. 30 ships, crews from 18 different species, equipped with the most advanced technology we've ever developed. And it's all based on collaborative design principles that didn't exist 3 years ago. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. "It's remarkable what we've accomplished. But I keep wondering, could we have achieved this cooperation without the crisis? Did our civilization have to nearly collapse before we learned to work together?" The question had troubled many of the Confederation's leaders. The transformation had been dramatic and largely successful, but it had come at an enormous cost. Millions had died during the transition period. Entire civilizations had been disrupted. The psychological trauma of near collapse still affected billions of beings. Threx approached them, his ancient form moving more slowly than it once had. The stress of recent years had taken its toll on the veteran politician, but there was a peace in his manner that hadn't been there during his council days. "I've been thinking about your question," he said to Sarah, "about whether this cooperation was only possible after crisis. And I think perhaps crisis was necessary, but not sufficient." Sarah turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "The crisis forced us to confront our failures, but it didn't automatically create solutions. That required something else. The willingness to admit we were wrong, to abandon our comfortable positions, to risk our pride for the possibility of something better." He gestured toward the construction site, where beings from across the galaxy were building humanity's dream of interstellar exploration. The old council could have faced the same crisis and chosen to double down on competition, to fight even harder for individual advantage. What made the difference was the choice to trust each other despite our history. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The launch of the intergalactic exploration fleet marked a turning point in galactic civilization. For the first time, the combined species of the galaxy were looking outward together, seeking new worlds and new possibilities as partners rather than competitors. The fleet's composition itself told the story of how far they had come. The flagship was human-designed but incorporated power systems developed by the Zephyrians, navigation technology from the crystalline domains, and life support systems created through collaboration between the Aquatic Federation and the Hive. Confederacy. Captain Maria Santos, Admiral Santos's daughter, who had grown up during the transformation, commanded a crew that represented the best of galactic cooperation. Her first officer was Caltharian, her chief engineer was from the Hive Confederacy, and her science officer was a crystalline being whose mathematical insights had revolutionized their understanding of intergalactic space. Fleet Command. This is Explorer 1. Santos reported as the ships prepared to depart known space. All vessels report ready for jump to extragalactic space. In the Unity Station Command Center, Sarah watched the fleet's departure with a mixture of pride and wonder. The young woman who had walked out of the council chambers in frustration 3 years ago could never have imagined this moment. Permission granted. Explorer 1, she responded. Good luck out there, as the fleet engaged their hybrid jump drives and disappeared into the void between galaxies. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Humanity's walk away from the galactic table had seemed like an ending, but it had actually been a beginning. The Confederation they had built wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still cultural conflicts, still the occasional crisis that tested their cooperative systems. But there was something fundamentally different about how they approached these challenges. Instead of viewing problems as competitions to be won, they saw them as puzzles to be solved together. Representative Clix, now serving as the Confederation's Chief Science Coordinator, joined Sarah at the observation window. The fleet's first reports should arrive in about 6 months, he chittered. The quantum communication arrays will let us stay in real-time contact even at intergalactic distances. Sarah smiled at the irony. The same species that had once tried to restrict human expansion were now facilitating humanity's greatest adventure. What do you think they'll find out there? Who knows? Clix's compound eyes reflected starlight. New civilizations, new challenges, new opportunities for cooperation, or maybe just empty space and cosmic phenomena. But whatever they find, they'll face it together. 5 years after the Great Walk Away, as historians had begun calling humanity's departure from the Council, Sarah Chen published her memoirs. The book, titled Beyond the Table, How Crisis Taught the Galaxy to Cooperate, became required reading in schools across known space. In her final chapter, she wrote, "We often assume that cooperation requires perfect understanding or complete trust. But our experience suggests something different. Sometimes the most productive partnerships emerge from the ashes of conflict, when all parties have been humbled enough to admit their limitations and brave enough to try something new." The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Even 5 years later, the Confederation faced regular challenges that tested their cooperative systems. Some species still struggled with the cultural changes required for true partnership. Some individuals never fully adapted to the new collaborative approaches, but the overall trajectory was clear. Galactic civilization had become more innovative, more resilient, and more just than it had ever been under the old hierarchical system. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had instead catalyzed the greatest period of progress in galactic history. The exploration fleet's reports from beyond the galaxy had already yielded discoveries that surpassed all expectations. Evidence of other galactic civilizations, exotic physical phenomena that challenged established scientific theories, and resources that could support expansion on an unprecedented scale. More importantly, the fleet's mixed crews were pioneering new forms of cooperation that went beyond anything achieved in home space. When faced with completely unknown challenges, beings from different species were finding that their diversity was their greatest strength. Dr. Alex Vorthak, a young Caltharian scientist who had grown up during the transformation, published research showing that mixed species research teams consistently outperform single species groups in problem-solving tasks. Her work suggested that the cooperative model wasn't just morally superior, it was measurably more effective. The old council feared diversity, she wrote. They saw differences between species as sources of conflict to be managed rather than resources to be utilized. The Confederation has shown that our differences, when properly coordinated, make us capable of achievements that no single species could accomplish alone. 10 years after the walk away, the Galactic Confederation had grown to encompass not just the original Council species, but dozens of newly contacted civilizations from the galaxy's rim. The cooperative model had proven so successful that most species chose to join voluntarily rather than maintain independence. The Confederation's success had also attracted attention from beyond the galaxy. The exploration fleets had made contact with 3 extragalactic civilizations, and preliminary negotiations were underway to establish formal diplomatic relations. Sarah, now in her 60s and serving her second term as co-coordinator, often reflected on the path that had brought them to this point. The angry young diplomat who had walked out of the council chambers had become one of the most respected leaders in galactic history, not because of any single achievement, but because she had helped build something that transcended the limitations of any individual. During a speech commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Confederation's founding, she addressed the question that many historians were already debating. People ask whether humanity saved galactic civilization or whether galactic civilization saved itself. I think that question misses the point. Salvation isn't something that one group does for another. It's something that emerges when everyone commits to building something better than what came before. The ceremony was held on New Unity, a planet that had been jointly terraformed by 12 different species using techniques that no single species could have developed alone. The world itself was a testament to what cooperation could achieve. Not a compromise between different visions, but a synthesis that exceeded all of them. Representatives from across the galaxy attended the ceremony, but perhaps the most significant presence was the group of young beings from mixed species families who had grown up during the transformation. They represented something entirely new in galactic history, individuals who saw cooperation not as a political necessity, but as a natural way of life. Zara Chan Clicks, Sarah's adopted daughter, the product of a relationship between a human scientist and a Hive Confederacy researcher, spoke for the younger generation. You tell us stories about the old days when species competed instead of collaborating, when difference was seen as division instead of strength. To us, those stories seem as ancient and incomprehensible as myths. We can't imagine a galaxy where beings wouldn't work together to solve problems and explore possibilities. Her words captured something profound about the transformation. It hadn't just changed institutions or policies, it had changed how an entire galaxy thought about itself and its possibilities. The success of the Galactic Confederation had created new challenges and opportunities that the founders had never anticipated. The discovery of habitable worlds in nearby galaxies, the development of technologies that made intergalactic travel routine, and the establishment of contact with multiple extragalactic civilizations had transformed the scope of cooperative civilization. The Intergalactic Cooperative Council, established 15 years after the original walk-away, represented over 40 different civilizations from 5 galaxies. The challenges of coordinating cooperation across such vast distances and between such diverse forms of life pushed the boundaries of everything they thought they knew about governance and diplomacy. Captain Santos, now Admiral Santos and commander of the entire exploration fleet, reported regularly on the wonders and challenges of intergalactic space. Each new civilization we encounter teaches us something new about cooperation, she explained during one briefing. Some species are collective minds that make decisions through biological consensus. Others are energy beings that exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. One civilization we've contacted consists entirely of artificial intelligences that evolved from the computational systems of an extinct biological species. The diversity was staggering, but the principles that had saved galactic civilization proved remarkably adaptable. The focus on mutual benefit rather than competition, the emphasis on utilizing differences as strengths rather than sources of conflict, and the commitment to transparency and equity in decision-making translated across radically different forms of consciousness and existence. Dr. Threx, the great-great-grandchild of the original Counselor Threx, named in honor of the leader who had helped guide the transformation, published groundbreaking research on what she called universal cooperation principles. Her work suggested that the collaborative approaches developed during the Confederation's formation weren't just solutions to galactic political problems, they were fundamental principles that could guide cooperation between any forms of intelligent life. The capacity for cooperation appears to be a prerequisite for any civilization advanced enough to achieve interstellar travel, she wrote. Species that remain trapped in competitive paradigms eventually destroy themselves or stagnate. Only those that learn to collaborate effectively can transcend the limitations of their home worlds and participate in larger forms of civilization. 20 years after humanity walked away from the table, Sarah Chen stood in the Grand Assembly of the Intergalactic Cooperative Council. The chamber was vast beyond imagination, utilizing technology that bent space itself to accommodate representatives from dozens of different forms of life and consciousness. The table they had built was no longer a physical structure, but a conceptual framework that spanned galaxies. Energy beings from the Andromeda Spiral participated alongside biological species from the local group. Artificial intelligences communicated with collective consciousness entities. Time-shifted beings whose subjective experience moved at different rates from baseline reality contributed to discussions about projects that would span millennia. As she looked around the assembly, Sarah marveled at how far they had come from that moment of frustrated anger when she had declared humanity's withdrawal from galactic politics. The walkaway that had seemed like an ending had become the first step in a journey towards something none of them could have imagined. The crisis that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization had taught them that competition and hierarchy were not the natural order of intelligent life, they were choices, and once they had learned to make different choices, the possibilities had become infinite. A young human intern, barely out of university, approached Sarah with a data pad containing reports from the newest exploration missions. "Mum, the Long-Range Contact Division is reporting first contact with a civilization from the Magellanic Clouds. They're requesting guidance on how to approach initial cooperation protocols." Sarah smiled, remembering her own youth and the simple belief that problems could be solved through persistence and good intentions. She had been right about the persistence, but she had never imagined that the solutions would be so much more beautiful and complex than the problems they had started with. "Tell them to remember the first principle," she said. "Don't try to bring them to our table. Help them build a table that works for everyone." As she spoke, she looked out through the chamber's reality viewing ports at the vast sweep of space beyond. Galaxies upon galaxies, each containing countless worlds and countless forms of life, all connected by the infinite possibilities of cooperation. Humanity had walked away from one table, but in doing so, they had helped build something infinitely larger. They had learned that the real power wasn't in controlling the conversation, but in expanding it to include voices that had never been heard before. The table they sat at now had room for everyone, and it kept growing. In the archives of the Intergalactic Cooperative Council, there is a simple plaque that reads, "Sometimes the most profound act of leadership is knowing when to walk away. Sometimes the greatest victory is achieved by refusing to play a game where victory is impossible. And sometimes the future begins with a single word? No, Below that inscription is a smaller line of text dedicated to Ambassador Sarah Chen and all those who chose to build something better rather than accept something broken. The story of humanity's walk away from the galactic table had become legend, told and retold across thousands of worlds and dozens of civilizations. But the real lesson wasn't about humanity's courage or the Council's failures. It was about what becomes possible when beings choose cooperation over competition, growth over stagnation, and hope over fear. The galaxy had learned that civilization isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build, together, one choice at a time, and the table never stops growing.